Hang Mandela. Those two words were on a wall near where I grew up as a kid in South Africa. I saw them the first time when I was driving past in my dad's car, sitting in the back seat. "Hey, Dad, who's Mandela?" I don't remember what he said, or even if he answered me. See, I was dreaming of space travel. The next time I drove past a few months later, it had been changed again, and it now read, "Hang on, Mandela." I smiled at the addition, and then I went back to daydreaming. A couple of years later, I saw it for the last time. I was about 12 years old, and this time it had been changed one final way to read, "Hang only, Mandela." That sign was a microcosm of what was going on in South Africa. And when I saw it, I concluded that the original graffiti artist had won this roadside argument. But I went back to daydreaming, this time about falling in love. But just 20 miles away and a couple of years earlier, in Soweto, a township where 6 million black people lived, segregated by the cruel apartheid laws of South Africa from where I lived, an uprising was brewing. That year, the South African government had changed the laws to require black students to learn in Afrikaans, a language that many couldn't understand and that all viewed as the language of their oppressive government. Some teachers had gone on strike and had been dismissed. Out of a growing frustration, the students in Soweto planned a peaceful march. On the 16th of June, 1976, 10,000 kids gathered to march on Orlando Stadium. Outside one small school, just 30 kids gathered. And when they were ready to join the rest of the group, the police arrived to stop them. The kids threw stones at them, and the police fired tear gas in response. No one knows who gave the order that day, but the police opened fire. And when they did, Hector Peterson went down. When the tear gas started to clear, his sister Antoinette could hear him crying for help. She found her way to his body, and as she did, an 18-year-old picked him up and carried him in his arms towards the closest car. They bundled him in the car, drove him to a clinic where Hector was pronounced dead on arrival. His mother only heard about his death the next day. He'd been living with his grandmother, who lived closer to his school. The police sent her to identify his body, and after she did, it took her 3 weeks to get her son back to give him a simple and quiet funeral. From that day, the uprising spread across South Africa, and by the end of that first year, 600 people had lost their lives. In vain. But perhaps Hector Peterson didn't lose his life in vain. This picture was splashed on the front pages of newspapers across the world, and the reaction shocked the South African government into action. They undid the laws requiring Afrikaans as a language of instruction. They spent more on schools and teacher training in Soweto. And they made the first tiny changes to these oppressive apartheid laws. Some would say Hector Peterson's death and the Soweto uprising was the beginning of a long and slow end to apartheid. Stephen Biko said, "It's better to die for an idea that will live than to live for an idea that will die." Hector Peterson died for the idea of freedom. When Nelson Mandela, already imprisoned on Robben Island for 14 years, heard the news of his death and the Soweto uprising, it gave him hope that the struggle for freedom continued. It had taken 15 weeks for the news to reach Nelson Mandela. I heard about Hector Peterson and the Soweto uprising 15 years later. See, I grew up in this utopian bubble of white apartheid South Africa, where my safety was virtually guaranteed, where my good education was something I took for granted, freedom is something I didn't even consider, and what I dreamed of was falling in love. But for 40 million black South Africans whose daily experience was being brutalized and hated for the color of their skin, danger was ever present. A good education, or any education in your own language, was something to fight for, something to die for. And freedom, of course, was just a dream. That contrast between my dreams of love and their reality is captured by Oriah Mountain Dreamer's poem, The Invitation. It doesn't interest me what planets are squaring your moon. I want to know if you have touched the center of your own sorrow, if you have been opened by life's betrayals or have become shriveled and closed from fear of further pain. I want to know if you can sit with pain without moving to hide it or fade it or fix it. But that poem speaks of love and dreams. It doesn't interest me what you do for a living. I want to know what you ache for. And if you dare to dream of meeting your heart's longing. Those words from that poem inspire me to invite you to join me looking at three things today. You see, that poem says that it's not interested in how old or how young you are, John. I want to know if you'll risk looking like a fool for love. Oh no. For your dream, change, and for the adventure of being alive. I invite you to look with me at the history of my country to see what the power of love can do to transform it from a place torn apart by hatred and apartheid into a place where love and healing and peace became possible. And to imagine with me, if the power of love can do that for a country, what it can do to sustain and humanize your company. I invite you to look at your families, functional or dysfunctional, for the habits of love that you see are missing in the world and missing from business today. And explore with me how to bring those to life, to bind our work families together. I invite you to look inside yourself, to find and to grow the mindset of love that can fuel this whole love revolution starting today. Nelson Mandela was finally released after 27 years in jail. By a show of hands, who remembers seeing this picture? South Africans celebrated, certainly all black South Africans and many whites. But some white South Africans held their breath. We weren't sure what would happen. Nelson Mandela immediately went to work negotiating the dismantling of apartheid with the South African government. And those negotiations were fractious, and they were interrupted or delayed by protests from the far right wing, by bombings, by assassinations, by massacres. After 4 long years, South Africa set its date for the first free and fair elections. The night before, a car bomb went off, killing 9 people. Nelson Mandela called for calm and peace and love, as he had throughout the negotiations. The night before, another one went off, and he again called for calm and peace and love. And finally, on the 27th of April, 1994, 20 million people lined up to cast their vote. The vast majority of them for the first time in their lives. Many stood for 14 hours in a line to have their voice heard. When the results came in, the African National Congress had won, and Nelson Mandela was our president. The country breathed out. The world celebrated. They call us the Rainbow Nation. We called ourselves the New South Africa. At midnight, the old South African flag was lowered, and this new South African flag, representing the merging of the many colors of people into one nation, was raised. The old national anthem, Die Stem, or the call in English and Afrikaans, was sung, but not for the last time as you'd expect. It was merged with Nkosi Sikeleli Afrika, representing the coming together of many languages of South Africa. We have the only national anthem in the world sung in 5 languages. Nelson Mandela had led our country peacefully to democracy. Few people expected that. In fact, we all thought there would be a civil war. History predicted that there would be a civil war. But his loving leadership had transformed and saved us. Yet while we celebrated, he knew before the hope of the new South Africa could be materialized, the country needed to heal. So he set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, and appointed Bishop Desmond Tutu to lead it. For 3 years, they went around the country, from church halls to schools, listening to the testimony of 22,000 people, victims of apartheid, sharing their stories. Some of those stories were filled with sadness, and even Bishop Tutu at times needed comforting. The TRC hired professional comforters just for this job. Now, the TRC, or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that we ran, was unlike any other in the rest of the world. There's been several, but what was unique to South Africa's is that we called and offered to the perpetrators an invitation to give their testimony on the condition that they admitted to their crime, told the whole truth, and could show that it was politically motivated. Colonel Eugene de Kock was one of those people who gave his testimony. He had led a band of government-sanctioned assassins. They'd been responsible for countless kidnappings, torture, disappearances, and the murder of more than 100 freedom fighters in South Africa. When he gave his testimony, you can understand why the country reacted in disgust, questioned the principles of restorative justice of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and called instead for punitive justice. One can understand if you were in the room that day, especially if you were a black person in that room that day, that you would have hate in your heart for this man. But inspired by Nelson Mandela's loving leadership and his example of putting love into action through forgiveness, Pumla Ndlovu comforted Prime Evil. That was the nickname that his colleagues had given him. He looks like he might be your kid's science teacher, but the love that must have been involved in the face of hatred or feelings of anger inspires me. I invite you to look at the history of your own countries for examples of loving leadership transformed into love in action. People like Eleanor Roosevelt, who stood for women's rights, who stood for civil rights, and much else in a long and illustrious career. People like Rosa Parks, as elegant and as beautiful and as fierce on her 90th birthday as she was on that day 50 years before when she refused to give up her seat on that bus. You know, she wasn't the first to be arrested for refusing to give up her seat, but she was the most famous, and she became the platform for Martin Luther King's dream for freedom. Hector Peterson was not the first to be shot on that day in Soweto. He was the most famous, and he became the platform for Nelson Mandela's dream for freedom. I'd like you now to think of your own loving leadership examples from your country. And when I ask you, take a moment to share with the person next to you the name of the loving leader that comes to mind and one word that reminds you of their loving action: forgiveness, compassion, joy, celebration. Please do that now. Yeah. I challenge you to stand on the shoulders of these giants and to take loving leadership into your business. If you're not a leader of your company, or even if you are, I challenge you to turn loving leadership into love in action, to sustain and humanize your business. To paraphrase Tolstoy, every functional family is similar. Every dysfunctional family is unique in its own weird and wonderful way. I don't know if you come from a functional or dysfunctional family. My own high-functioning, largely dysfunctional family comprises 4 girls and 4 boys. I'm the youngest of this gang of 8. People would ask my mom, why did you keep having kids and stop at 8? And she said, we only had 8 places at the dinner table. My brothers said my mom kept having kids until she saw me and in disgust stopped. It's okay. I like to think my mom just kept trying until she got it right. But like any family, we had our challenges too. In 1980, my older brother, William, he's the one with the scruffy beard in this picture, went go-kart racing with his friends in an abandoned drive-in movie theater. Who remembers going to a movie theater outdoors? I don't think there are many of them left in the world. At the end of the day, after they'd been go-kart riding for the whole day, my younger sister, Leanne, the most studious and the quietest of us all, and tagged along, and she said to William, can I have a go? William didn't think twice. He put her in the go-kart, put a helmet on her head, gave her some instructions, and sent her off, and then he turned around to carry on packing up. Leanne raced down that first straight, into the hard right-hand turn, put her foot hard on the accelerator by mistake. When William turned around, he saw the go-kart tumbling through the air. He started to run towards Leanne. He thought that she'd be bruised and battered, but otherwise okay. When he got to her, he saw that her helmet had come off. She had driven underneath a wire fence that had done extensive damage to her face. She was unconscious and bleeding, and he picked her up in his arms, and with his friend by his side, ran to the closest car, drove her to hospital, and after 12 hours of surgery, she came out alive. Now, I don't know these details of what happened to my sister, and many more that I haven't shared with you, from remembering them. I was just a kid, and my mom had shielded me from what went on. My sister finally came home from hospital 9 months later, and I know all of the details of what she went through, learning to swallow again, learning to chew again, to talk again, and eventually to smile again. From reading the paper of her case study that was published 22 years later by Dr. Wolfart. He had worked on her case for more than 5 years after her accident. There was a second author of that paper, the head of maxillofacial prosthodontics at the leading university and dental school in South Africa. Professor Leanne Sykes, my sister, was that second author. She is and always will be my absolute hero. But she's not the only hero of this story. On the day of Leanne's accident, my mom, her first instinct was to come and pick me up from a birthday party. She took me home, gathered all of her kids close before she raced off to the hospital. The physicians and the surgeons said to her and William, "Leanne will be in surgery for many hours. Go home." When they got home, I was still up. They didn't know I was watching through the window, and I saw my brother William take off his clothes, one piece more bloody than the next, sobbing. Years later, he told me he couldn't remember if he had done Leanne's helmet up. And then I saw my mom comfort him. We went to bed that night, and my mom went back to the hospital to be not by her side, but to be close. So when I woke up the next morning at 6 a.m., I was surprised to hear my mom's voice, just like any other morning. I smelled cooked, healthy breakfast like we ate every other morning, and we were sent off to school like it was an ordinary day. Life carried on, and then my mom went back to the hospital. And from that day on, hours became weeks, became months, became years that she spent time with Leanne, going to appointments and going to rehab. When Leanne finally came home and was ready to re-enter society, to go back to school as a 15-year-old girl, scarred physically and emotionally, it hurt her when kids who didn't know better would say, "Hey, Mom, what happened to that girl's face?" But when teenage boys who should have known better made unkind comments, it broke her heart. And so my mom took us on our first vacation as a family. Now, there aren't many hotels that want a family of 8 kids, let alone can accommodate them. But to give Leanne some space and some time to find her inner strength and to become who she was meant to be. I loved that vacation. I met and fell in love with Ashley. We had this amazing 2-day love affair. You know, there was challenging times for our family, but they were also happy times. At least once or twice a year, my mom would drink a couple of glasses of champagne. At some stage, she would stand up and announce, "I'm a little tipsy," as she called it. We thought that was an understatement. And then she would begin to giggle. And after a while, her giggles would become uncontrollable laughter. And then she would dance, filled with ecstasy and the joy of having her family close. Araya's poem, The Invitation, continues. "It doesn't interest me to know where you live or how much money you have. I want to know if you will get up after the night of grief and despair, weary and bruised to the bone, and do what needs to be done to feed the children. I want to know if you can see beauty, even when it's not pretty, every day, and if you can source your own life from its presence. It doesn't interest me to know how you came to be here. I want to know if you will stand in the center of the fire with me and not shrink back. I want to know if you can live with failure, yours and mine, and still stand at the edge of the lake and shout to the silver of the full moon, 'Yes!' "15 years later, my mom was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And she died shortly thereafter, but at her funeral, her 8 kids stood around in the rain, all of us thinking, who now will hold us close? Who now will be the glue for our family? But you know, we needn't have worried because my mom had taught us the habits of love that I now see are missing in the world and missing from business today. In times of tragedy, gather people close. Don't lay them off. When someone makes a mistake, comfort them. Don't reprimand them. When someone's injured emotionally or physically, spend time with them to allow them to heal. If necessary, give them the privacy to find their inner strength and to become who they're meant to become. Celebrate the ecstasy of being alive and the joy that work should be. I want you now to look at your own family and very intentionally acknowledge the love and the love habits that you learn from your mom, from your dad, or from your cousins and your brothers and sisters, and share with the person next to you who's an inspiring person in your family and one word that represents that habit of love that you learned from them. Please do that now. Thank you. In 2007, in Chicago, I walked into a 3-day seminar on integrity. My girlfriend, Marnie, had recommended that I come to this seminar. She thought that I needed some, integrity. I didn't know what to expect from this seminar, but I was certain of 3 things. I had no relationship with my dad. I was happy I had no relationship with my dad. We hadn't had a civil conversation in 25 years. I was certain I was never, ever going to get married. I had a plan for my life. It was date some more, die. Yet I was certain that I longed for a family. I ached to have children of my own. That first morning I realized the reason I have no relationship with my dad was because of a story I was making up about him, what he had done and what he hadn't done to me. It was a story in which I was the victim. I looked inside myself and I didn't like what I saw when I noticed that we had no relationship because of choices I had made. The second thing I realized was that before I could become a father, I needed to learn how to be a son. On the second morning of that seminar, the instructor reminded us of the promise we had made at the beginning, which was no alcohol during the course. Everyone got that? You all agree? Well, it's not the rules that apply here, of course. And before lunch that day, he reminded of us of that promise we had made, and we all agreed again, me too. And then we were broken up into groups of 5 and sent to lunch. When the waiter came to take our order, I ordered a cheeseburger and a beer, because, rules don't apply to me. There was a woman sitting across from me. She mumbled something. So I leaned back. I said, you have something to say? She looked up at me and she said, yes, you have no integrity and you're a jerk. It's not exactly what she said, but I started to seethe. I felt the blood coming up through my body, into my neck and into my head. I was angry because I didn't know what to say. And as I sat there, angry, I realized I was feeling something else. I was embarrassed and I was shamed. And worse, she was right. I had been a jerk to her and to my dad and to many people in life. I did not like what I saw at all. When the waiter came back and I'd gone through all of this in my head, I apologized to him. I sent my beer back. I said I'd made a mistake. I apologized to that woman. 2 years later, I married that girl. Hi, Maddie. That night, I was very excited about everything I've learned. And I looked inside myself. I found the mindset of love. And I called my dad. It was 6 a.m. in South Africa. I was waking him up, and I started to ramble on about all these new insights in the story. And then I met this girl, and he said, Andrew, what are you trying to say? I got my thoughts together, and for the first time in my life, I said, Dad, I love you. And I hope we can have a wonderful relationship. Silence. It felt like about 3 days. It was probably about 30 seconds. And then my dad could be heard to gather his thoughts, and he said, Andrew, that's all I've ever wanted. Maddie and I built a beautiful relationship with him. When his health was failing, he came all the way to Chicago to be with us on our wedding day. A couple of years later, he was diagnosed with cancer. We visited him in April. I promised him we'd be back in January for his 80th birthday. Our plan was to get all 8 kids together and all these millions of grandkids and have one grand celebration for his birthday. In July, I was on a train going into the mountains in southern Colorado. My phone rang. My dad's health had taken a turn. All my brothers and sisters had said their goodbyes. The hospice nurse thought that he was waiting for something, holding on, and that it was to speak to me. They put the phone by his ear, and I said, for the last time in my life, Dad, I love you. I'm so grateful for the example you gave me as a man and as a father. Thank you for 5 amazing years that we wouldn't have otherwise had. It's time to let go. And my phone died. I summited that mountain the next day. I got to the top and wrote his name in the book, William Charles Philip Sykes. 3 p.m. Sunday afternoon. The next day I came down, back on the train. I got cell phone reception and found a message that my dad had passed away. 3 p.m. Sunday afternoon. Now, I am not one that believes in coincidences. But I do feel it was some poignant that when I was at the peak of this mountain, we were at the peak of our relationship as father and son. None of which would have been possible if I hadn't looked inside myself, not liked what I saw, but somehow managed to find and to grow this mindset of love. The invitation continues. It doesn't interest me if the story you're telling me is true. I want to know if you can disappoint another to be true to yourself, if you can bear the accusation of betrayal and not betray your own soul, if you can be faithless and therefore trustworthy. It doesn't interest me what or where or with whom you studied. I want to know what sustains you from the inside when all else falls away. I want to know if you can be alone with yourself and if you truly like the company that you keep in those empty moments. I had not. But I invite you now, challenge you to look inside yourself. Whether you like what you see or you don't, dig for and find that mindset of love that can help you mend long broken relationships at work. That can help you to be the fertile soil in which new relationships like mine with Maddie had grown at work with colleagues and customers. Today I invited you to look at the history of our countries to see what the power of love can do to transform them, to bring peace. Imagine what it can do for your company. I invited you to look at the history of your family, for the habits of love that we should take with us to work and grow them to bind our work families together. I invited you to look inside yourself for that mindset of love that can heal long broken relationships. I'm inspired by that poem, The Invitation. If you'd like a copy of that poem, please text Love Summit to 44222 when you get a break or later today. Please join Ryan Picarella, Hanley, and myself for our workshop this afternoon, where we'll bring to life work habits, love habits at work, and explore how to make them a constant and ever-present part of our businesses. I'm so grateful for the partnership we have with the Love Summit and the opportunity to offer our Love Habits workshops into companies to bring this work to life. It's really a deep honor for us. Thank you. My inspiration from Araya had me write a few lines for you. It doesn't interest me if you're addicted to the feeling of being in love. I want to know if you can hold the mindset of love at work when all around you are resigned or driven by greed. I want to know if you can practice the habits of love at work when doing nothing at all seems easier, or when doing things the way we've always done them is all that's asked of you. I want to know if you can unleash the power of love at work for yourself and for others and transform business into the force for good, for what's right, for the health of the planet and all of its people. But I'm not interested if you're well-wishing. I want to know if you're well-doing. Be the spark that ignites this whole love revolution. Create and grow the ultimate addiction to the habits that matter at work, the habits of love. Please be the power of love